The arrow didn't just hit Jacob Thorne. It pinned him to the side of the overturned stagecoach like a wanted poster. Sarah McKinnon watched, her scream caught in her throat as the shaft punched clean through his shoulder, scraping bone and burying its head deep in the splintered wood. The thunder of hooves was deafening, but over it, she heard his sharp, ragged gasp for air. The riders who called themselves Apache disappeared into the Red Rock canyons as quickly as they came. They weren't just raiders, they were too efficient, too precise. They took the driver and the guard, they took the slick traveling salesman, and they took the young bride, Maria, who was supposed to be meeting her husband in Sacramento. But they left Sarah, and they left the half-breed scout, Jacob, bleeding out in the Colorado dirt. A dark stain spread across his buckskin jacket. Fast, too fast. When Sarah pressed a torn piece of her petticoat to the wound, her fingers came back slick and hot with his life. They were 3 days from Fort Collins. Snow was already dusting the peaks. No rescue was coming until spring. She had a choice. Let this stranger die as her world in Boston would have demanded, or risk everything she was supposed to be, to keep his heart beating. But that wasn't the real choice. She'd learned soon enough that the real choice had already been made for her, long before she ever stepped foot on that coach. Jacob's fever hit like a physical blow. The abandoned mining cabin she'd found was their only shelter, a drafty box smelling of old tobacco and forgotten lives. She dragged him there on a makeshift sled, his body a dead weight, his life hanging by a thread thinner than her own frayed nerves. Now that thread was snapping. His body shook so violently the floorboards rattled. His breathing was a shallow, panicked whisper in the crushing silence of the mountains. There was only one thing left to do. A Boston widow, 6 months in mourning for a man she never loved, stripped off her proper wool dress. In nothing but her thin undergarments, she lay down beside this stranger, this man whose blood would have gotten him thrown out of any home she'd ever known. She wrapped her arms around his burning body, trying to force her own warmth into him, trying to fight the cold that was claiming him from the inside out. His pulse fluttered against her lips, a trapped bird beating its wings against the cage of his ribs. She whispered prayers she barely remembered into the darkness. She told herself it was for him. But as the wind howled outside like a legion of ghosts, she knew she was praying for herself. She had buried a husband, a man 20 years her senior, in a marriage that was a business deal. She had felt nothing but a quiet relief. Yet here, clinging to a dying stranger in a forgotten cabin, she felt a terror so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. Because what she was feeling wasn't pity. It was something else, something far more dangerous. And it had just begun. The cabin was a ghost of a home, a stone fireplace, a scarred table, two rickety stools. But the man who built it knew how to survive. Sarah found a bag of beans, hard as rocks, some jerky wrapped in cloth, a tin of coffee. Outside, a pile of firewood in a bucket. Life's barest essentials: water, food, warmth. It would have to be enough. For 3 days she was his keeper. She boiled the jerky into a thin broth. She cleaned the wound, a gruesome tear of flesh and muscle, fighting back waves of nausea. She hauled water from a creek that was already freezing over, the ice cracking like rifle shots in the cold. On the third day, his eyes opened. They weren't hazy with fever anymore. They were sharp, and they were focused right on her. He was weak, but he was alive, and he understood. He saw her stained dress, her wild hair, the exhaustion etched into her face. He saw the woman she had become. "You should have left me," he rasped, his voice a dry scrape. "They will say things, terrible things." Sarah didn't flinch. She spooned more broth toward his lips. "Let them," she said, and her voice was a stranger's, hard and clear. "I stopped caring what anyone says the moment you started breathing again." But Jacob wasn't looking at her with gratitude. He was looking at her with fear, not for himself, for her, because he knew something she didn't. He knew the men who attacked them weren't just Apache, and he knew they would be back. Jacob Thorne was a man made of secrets. He sold his skills as a tracker to the army, but that was just a cover. His Cherokee grandmother taught him to read the land. His Irish father gave him a restlessness that kept him moving. He was a phantom, never staying in one place long enough to be known. He knew the frontier, and he knew its darkness. And looking at Sarah McKinnon, with her proper accent and her hidden steel, he felt a part of himself he'd thought long dead stir to life. He saw her bravery, but he also saw her innocence. An innocence he knew was about to be shattered. She thought this was a story of survival. A Boston widow and a wounded scout against the wilderness. A simple, brutal narrative. She had no idea she was a pawn in a much deadlier game. Sarah moved about the cabin with an efficiency that surprised him. Her hands, once soft and pale, now chapped and capable. She learned to split kindling, to haul water, to live a life stripped of all pretense. She was shedding her old skin, layer by layer. But Jacob knew that what lay underneath was more vulnerable than ever. He watched her as his strength returned. He taught her which plants to eat, how to make snares from the wreckage of the coach. They spoke in careful pieces, sharing bits of their past like rationed food. She told him of her stifling life in Boston, of a cold marriage and colder parents. He told her of a life lived between two worlds, belonging to neither. An intimacy grew between them, born of shared hardship and forced proximity. But under it all, a current of tension pulled taut. Every time a branch snapped in the woods, he would go still, his hand reaching for the knife she had salvaged. He wasn't just recovering, he was preparing. He never told her what he was really doing on that stagecoach. He never told her that the young bride Maria was no bride at all. He never told her that the attack wasn't a random act of violence. It was an assassination, an execution, and he was the only witness left alive. For now. The first heavy snow came on the 10th day, sealing them in. It was a beautiful prison, the world outside silenced and white. The cold became their constant companion, a physical presence in the small cabin. Sarah had been sleeping on a bed of pine boughs by the fire, clinging to the last shreds of propriety. But the night the temperature plunged and the wind screamed like a banshee, Jacob knew that stubbornness would kill them. "You'll freeze over there," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to share the cot, for the warmth." The first night was an agony of awareness. Two bodies, inches apart, separated by a universe of unspoken rules. She lay rigid, her back to him. He stared into the darkness, listening to her breathing. But the cold was a relentless enemy. Slowly, unconsciously, they drifted together. Her head found the hollow of his good shoulder. His arm came around her waist. It wasn't about desire, not yet. It was about survival, a simple biological truth. Two warm bodies have a better chance than one. But as the nights passed, something shifted. The rigid lines of their bodies softened. They learned the shape of each other in the dark, the rhythm of each other's sleep. And in that shared darkness, Jacob's secrets began to surface. He would murmur in his sleep, fragments of conversations, names that meant nothing to her. "The serpent's eye," he whispered one night, his voice tight with fear. "It's not in the box. She never had it." Sarah stored the words away, unsettling pieces of a puzzle she didn't know she was solving. She started watching him more closely during the day. She saw the way he surveyed the surrounding woods, not like a man enjoying the view, but like a soldier watching for an ambush. He was hiding something, something big. The arrow that nearly killed him hadn't been a random shot, and the people who fired it hadn't given up. This quiet cabin wasn't a sanctuary, it was a hiding place, and the walls were closing in. The kiss happened on a morning so bright it hurt the eyes. Sunlight streamed through the single grimy window, making the dust motes dance like tiny diamonds. Sarah was watching Jacob's hands as he carved a piece of wood. Strong, capable hands that knew how to set a trap, clean a wound, and hold a knife. She'd spent weeks telling herself this was gratitude, that what she felt for this man was a debt for her life. But it was a lie, a flimsy, Boston-bred lie. She leaned across the small space between them, her heart hammering against her ribs, and touched her lips to his. It was hesitant at first, a question. He went still, the knife dropping from his hand. He pulled back and looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough. Sarah laughed, a sound that felt foreign and wonderful. "I have been certain of nothing since I left home," she said. "But I am certain of this." And when he kissed her back, it wasn't a question, it was an answer. What followed was a slow, deliberate unraveling of every rule she had ever lived by. In the long afternoons, with the snow piled high outside, they discovered a world within the four walls of the cabin. A world of touch and breath and whispered truths. But even in their moments of deepest intimacy, the shadow lingered. Jacob would hold her, his body pressed against hers, yet his eyes would be scanning the tree line outside the window. One afternoon, while mending his jacket, Sarah's fingers found a hidden pocket sewn into the lining. Inside was a small, tightly folded piece of oilcloth. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was a drawing, a detailed sketch of the traveling salesman from the stagecoach, and underneath a name, Silas Kane. Beside it, a notation, U.S. Marshal. The blood drained from her face. The friendly salesman, the one who'd shared stories and candy with the young bride, was a lawman. It made no sense. He'd been taken by the raiders just like the others. Unless, unless he hadn't been taken at all. Unless he was one of them. She looked at Jacob, who was watching her, his face a grim mask. He hadn't been surprised that she found it. He'd been waiting. His name isn't Silas Kane, Jacob said, his voice flat and cold. And he's no marshal. He's the man who hired me, and he's the man who tried to have me killed. The story Jacob told her shattered the fragile world they had built. He wasn't just a scout. He worked for a clandestine branch of the government, men who operated in the shadows. His mission was to escort a courier, the woman Maria, who was carrying a ledger. A ledger that implicated some of the most powerful men in the country, from railroad barons to senators in a massive conspiracy to steal land from the Utes. Silas Kane, the salesman, was his contact. But Kane had double-crossed him. The attack wasn't Apache. It was Kane's own men, disguised to cover their tracks. They killed the driver and guard to eliminate witnesses. They took Maria to get the ledger. And they shot Jacob to silence him forever. They thought he was dead, but they were wrong. So they got the ledger, Sarah whispered, her mind reeling. Jacob shook his head slowly. No, that's the part they don't know. He reached into the woodpile by the hearth and pulled out a log that was split differently from the others. He twisted it, and a hidden compartment opened. Inside, nestled in a hollowed-out space, was a small leather-bound book. Maria was smart, Jacob said. She knew Kane was dirty. She suspected a trap. She passed this to me just before the attack, while Kane was distracted. So this was it, the reason for the blood and the killing. A simple book filled with names and numbers. A book that could bring down an empire of corruption. A book that Silas Kane and his powerful friends would kill anyone to get back. Sarah looked from the ledger to Jacob's face. She finally understood the fear in his eyes. They weren't just hiding from the winter. They were hiding from an army of assassins who knew he was alive. And now they would be coming for the book. They would be coming for them both. The cabin, once their sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching footsteps. The ledger sat on the table between them, a small, dark thing radiating immense power and danger. Sarah's past life in Boston, with its trivial concerns and predictable routines, seemed like a story about someone else. The woman she was now understood that survival wasn't just about food and warmth. It was about outthinking an enemy who was smarter, stronger, and had no rules. What did Maria look like? Sarah asked, a strange premonition creeping over her. Jacob described her, young, dark-haired, with a small silver locket she always wore. A locket, he said, that contained a key to a safe box in Sacramento where she kept corroborating evidence. The description was unremarkable, except for one detail. What was her sister's name? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Margaret, Jacob replied. She was traveling west to meet her sister, Margaret. The air left Sarah's lungs in a rush. Her sister, the one she was traveling to meet in California. Her name was Margaret. It was a coincidence. It had to be. A chilling, impossible coincidence. She reached for her own travel bag, her hands shaking. She pulled out a small, framed photograph. A picture of her and her younger sister, taken just before Margaret left for the West. She pushed it across the table toward Jacob. He stared at it, his face paling. The woman in the picture, standing beside Sarah, was the same woman he knew as Maria, the courier. That's her, he breathed. That's the woman I was protecting. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. The woman who died, the government agent carrying a deadly secret, was her sister's new sister-in-law. Her journey west was no longer a simple family reunion. It was a collision course with a conspiracy that had already consumed one member of her family. And then, a worse thought, a colder thought. Was it a coincidence at all? Her late husband, Thomas, had been a man of many secrets and powerful friends. Men involved in railroads, in Western expansion. Men like the ones named in that ledger. Had Thomas known? Had he arranged her trip west for a reason she couldn't fathom? The questions swirled, dark and poisonous. She felt like a puppet whose strings were only now becoming visible. Her entire life, her marriage, her widowhood, this very journey, had it all been a lie, orchestrated by unseen hands for a purpose she was just beginning to grasp? She looked at Jacob, her only ally in this wilderness of lies, and saw the same dawning horror reflected in his eyes. They weren't just two strangers thrown together by chance. They were two pieces of the same deadly puzzle, and someone had put them on the board to be sacrificed. The discovery twisted everything. Sarah's grief for her sister's family was now tangled with a terrifying web of deceit. Was her sister Margaret safe? Did she know her husband's family was connected to this? Or was she another unsuspecting pawn? The questions were a torment with no answers. But there was no time for grief or confusion. The immediate threat was the cabin itself. It was their shelter, but it was also a trap. Cain knew Jacob was the scout on that route. If he survived, this was the logical place he would seek refuge. They had to assume Cain's men were already on their way. They worked with a new frantic energy. Jacob, using the skills his grandmother had taught him, began to turn the cabin and the surrounding woods into a fortress. He showed Sarah how to build deadfalls, tripwires made from salvaged cord, and pits hidden beneath a dusting of snow. He taught her to use the small pistol she'd kept hidden in her luggage, a relic of her husband's she'd brought for protection. The weight of it in her hand felt alien but necessary. This was her new reality, a world where a proper lady had to learn how to kill. Inside the cabin, Sarah studied the ledger. The names were a roll call of the nation's elite, but it was the numbers, the columns of transactions and dates that held the real story. And one entry made her stop cold. A large payment made to a Boston holding company, a company she recognized. It was owned by her late husband, Thomas. The proof was right there in stark black ink. Thomas, the quiet, distant man she had married, was not just a part of the conspiracy. He was one of its bankers. Her journey west, her entire life, had been funded by blood money. The realization was a physical blow, leaving her breathless and hollow. He knew, she whispered to Jacob, tracing her husband's name with a trembling finger. He must have known about my sister's connection to Maria. He sent me out here. But why? Jacob looked at the ledger, then at her. A dark suspicion was forming in his mind. What else did you bring with you? Any papers from him? A package to be delivered? Sarah shook her head. Nothing. Just my luggage. And... She stopped. Her hand went to the ornate silver locket around her neck. A wedding gift from Thomas. Heavy, intricate, and always worn. She never took it off. It was too difficult to open the clasp. Jacob's eyes fixed on it. Let me see it. With careful precision, using the tip of his knife, he worked at the clasp. It didn't open. Instead, he found a minuscule seam along the locket's edge. He twisted it. The front of the locket didn't swing open. It unscrewed. It wasn't a locket at all. It was a container. And nestled inside on a bed of faded velvet wasn't a picture or a lock of hair. It was a small, strangely shaped brass key. It was the key Maria was supposed to be carrying. The key to the Sacramento safe box. Thomas hadn't sent her to her death. He'd used her. He'd turned his own wife into an unwitting courier, carrying the one thing that could expose his entire criminal enterprise, believing she was the one person no one would ever suspect. The betrayal was absolute. Her dead husband had reached out from the grave to put a target on her back. Silas Cain wasn't just looking for the ledger now. He was looking for the key, and Sarah was wearing it around her neck. Christmas Eve arrived without ceremony, marked only by the relentless fall of snow. They shared a meager meal of rabbit stew, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. The ledger and the key sat on the mantelpiece, objects of terrible power. That night, they came together not with the passionate discovery of before, but with a desperate, clinging intensity. It was a confirmation of life in the face of death, a shared warmth against a world that had turned murderously cold. They were no longer just survivors. They were partners bound by a secret that could get them killed or, if they lived, change the course of the country. The new year brought a blizzard that buried the cabin in a deep white tomb. For 3 days they were cut off from the world, a temporary reprieve. They used the time to plan. Jacob drew maps in the ash of the fireplace, plotting escape routes. Sarah, her mind sharpened by anger and betrayal, memorized names and figures from the ledger, becoming a living duplicate of the evidence. She was no longer Sarah McKinnon, the Boston widow. That woman was a ghost. In her place was someone harder, someone who understood that justice wasn't something you were given. It was something you took. One morning, the storm broke. The world was pristine and silent, too silent. Jacob stood at the window, his body rigid. He'd seen something, a flicker of movement in the trees at the edge of the clearing. Not an animal, something deliberate, organized. "They're here," he said, his voice a low growl. Sarah grabbed the pistol, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Peeking through a crack in the chinking, she saw them. 6 men clad in winter furs moving with military precision, fanning out to surround the cabin. And at their head, a man with a familiar face, now stripped of its friendly salesman's mask and twisted into a cruel, determined snarl. Silas Kane. He had found them. The siege began, not with a bang, but with a voice. "Thorn!" Kane's shout cut through the crisp air. "I know you're in there, and I know you have the woman. Send out the ledger and the key, and I'll let her live." It was a classic villain's promise, as empty as the wind. Jacob didn't answer. He just looked at Sarah and gave a slight shake of his head. They both knew Kane wouldn't leave witnesses. "He thinks it's just me," Jacob whispered. "He doesn't know what you've become." He was right. Kane saw a half-breed scout and a fragile Boston lady. He had no idea he was facing two cornered wolves. The first shot shattered the window, showering the room in glass and freezing air. The fight was on. Jacob returned fire with his rifle, his shots measured and precise, forcing them to keep their distance. But they were outnumbered. It was only a matter of time. Kane's men began to advance, using the trees for cover. One of them stumbled, letting out a sharp cry as his leg plunged into one of Jacob's hidden pits. A small victory, but it bought them time. Hours passed in a blur of smoke, noise, and adrenaline. The cabin was being torn apart, splinter by splinter. They were running low on ammunition. Kane, growing impatient, changed tactics. Under the cover of heavy fire, 2 of his men rushed the door with a log, using it as a battering ram. The thick wood groaned, then splintered. The bar holding it was about to give way. "Get ready," Jacob grunted, reloading his last few rounds. This was the end. They would come through the door, and it would be over. But Sarah had an idea, born of desperation and memories of Boston chemistry lessons. While Jacob laid down covering fire, she worked frantically. The prospector had left behind tins of lamp oil, and her luggage contained several bottles of strong perfume. Mostly alcohol, she poured it all into a large cast-iron pot, stuffing it with rags. It was a desperate, insane gamble. The door burst inward. 2 of Kane's men spilled into the room, guns raised. Jacob dropped the first one instantly. The second leveled his pistol at Sarah. Before he could fire, she lit a rag with a burning ember from the fire and hurled the pot. It exploded in a ball of flame and greasy smoke, engulfing the doorway. The gunman screamed, batting at the fire that clung to his clothes. The blaze caught on the dry timbers of the doorframe, spreading with terrifying speed. They had traded one death for another. The cabin was now a funeral pyre. "The back!" Jacob yelled, grabbing the ledger and the key. There was a small root cellar door hidden beneath a rug in the back room. It was their only way out. He kicked it open, revealing a dark, earthy-smelling tunnel. "Go!" he urged her. They scrambled into the narrow space, emerging into the biting cold behind the cabin, just as the roof began to collapse in a shower of sparks and flame. They didn't look back. They plunged into the deep snow of the forest, the shouts and chaos of Cain's men behind them. They were alive. They were free. But they were exposed with no shelter, dwindling supplies, and a pack of killers on their trail. The hunt had just entered its deadliest phase. The wilderness was a brutal, impartial enemy. The fire had bought them a head start, but Cain was a relentless tracker, and his men were seasoned killers. They ran, Jacob pushing them onward, reading the terrain, choosing paths that would leave the faintest trail. Sarah, fueled by a rage she never knew she possessed, kept pace. The woman who once fainted at the sight of a mouse was now plunging through waist-deep snow, a pistol in her hand, and a dead man's secrets in her mind. Every step was a battle against the cold that gnawed at their bones. They found temporary shelter in a shallow cave behind a frozen waterfall, the curtain of ice hiding them from view. Huddled together in the dark, they took stock. They had the ledger, the key, and one pistol with 3 bullets left. Not much of an arsenal against Cain's small army. "He'll expect us to head for Fort Collins," Jacob said, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "It's the only logical move, so we're not going to do it." He pulled out the strange map they'd found in the cabin, the one with the bizarre symbols. The man who built that cabin, the prospector, he wasn't just a miner. "This isn't a map to a gold claim." He pointed to a symbol that looked like a coiled serpent. "The serpent's eye," Sarah whispered, remembering Jacob's fevered words. "What is it?" Jacob tapped the map. "My people have stories about this place. A place of bad spirits, they called it. A maze of canyons and hot springs that steam in the winter. The Utes avoided it. They called it the land that breathes smoke." The prospector, he wasn't running from the law. He was hiding. This map leads to his last refuge. It was a wild gamble, to flee into a place even the Utes feared, hoping it would shield them from Cain. But it was the only plan they had. They traveled by night, resting during the day, the cold their only blanket. The hunger was a constant, dull ache. On the 3rd day, they saw the smoke. Thin plumes of steam rising from the ground ahead, twisting into the gray sky. The land that breathes smoke. They had found it. The entrance was a narrow crack in a rock wall, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Inside, the world changed. It was a sunken labyrinth of narrow canyons, the ground warm to the touch. Geysers of hot water hissed from fissures in the rock, shrouding the entire area in a thick, disorienting fog. The air smelled of sulfur and wet earth. It was a hellish, primordial landscape, but it was also the perfect hiding place. They followed the prospector's map deeper into the maze. The symbols began to make sense. A drawing of a twisted tree marked a fork in the path. A sketch of a bear's skull pointed toward a source of fresh water. The man had left a trail for someone to follow. But who? They found his final camp in a large cavern, its entrance hidden behind a screen of rock. It was like he had vanished in the middle of a meal. A petrified piece of bread sat on a plate. A journal lay open on a cot. And on the far wall he had carved his final message. "They found me. The serpent's eye is safe. Avenge us." Sarah read the last entries of the journal. The prospector's name was Elias, and he hadn't been alone. He had a partner, a Ute man who had betrayed his people to work with the conspiracy, feeding them information about the land they wanted to steal. But the Ute had a change of heart. Together, he and Elias had gathered the evidence, the very same evidence in the ledger, to expose the men they once served. But the conspiracy's agents, led by a younger, even more ruthless Silas Cain, had hunted them down. The Ute partner was killed. Elias fled here, to this maze, with his half of the proof. And he waited. Suddenly, a noise from the cavern entrance, a pebble skittering down the rocks. Jacob grabbed Sarah, pulling her into the shadows, his hand over her mouth. A figure appeared, silhouetted against the steamy air. It was one of Cain's men, his rifle at the ready. Cain hadn't been fooled. He had followed them into the maze. They were trapped. The gunman moved slowly into the cavern, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He crept past their hiding place, heading toward the back of the cave. This was their chance. Jacob moved like a ghost. He slipped behind the man, his knife a silent blur. It was over in a second. A swift, brutal, necessary act of survival. Sarah stared at the body, her stomach churning. But there was no time for shock. They heard shouts from the canyon. The man wasn't alone. "We can't go back the way we came," Jacob hissed. "There has to be another way out." He scanned the cavern walls. His eyes fell on the prospector's final message. "The serpent's eye is safe." It wasn't a metaphor. He looked around the cavern. High up on one wall was a rock formation that looked like a carving of a snake, and in its center a dark circular opening. An eye, another tunnel. It was their only hope. Jacob boosted Sarah up. The opening was a tight squeeze leading into a dark, narrow passage. They scrambled through, pulling themselves along the rough rock, the sounds of Cain's men echoing from the cavern behind them. The tunnel twisted and turned, sloping steeply downward. After what felt like an eternity, they saw a faint light ahead. They emerged not into the open, but into another, smaller chamber. This one, however, was different. It was filled with Ute artifacts, weapons, pottery, ceremonial robes, and in the center of the chamber, on a raised platform, sat an old man. He was dressed in traditional Ute buckskins, his face a mask of wrinkles, his eyes as dark and ancient as the rock around him. He wasn't surprised to see them. He looked as if he had been waiting. "You have brought the ghost of Elias back to this place," the old man said, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "I am called Black Kettle, and this land you have entered is sacred." Jacob spoke to him in the Ute dialect, a language Sarah didn't understand. The conversation was long and somber. Finally, Jacob turned to her. "This is the partner of Elias," he said. "The man the journal said was killed. But he wasn't. He was left for dead, but his people found him and brought him here to heal. He has been the keeper of this place, and Elias's secret ever since." Black Kettle had been waiting for someone to bring the other half of the evidence. He had his own proof: letters, sworn statements, and a treaty map showing the original boundaries of the Ute lands, the one the conspirators had buried. "Cain's men are a desecration to this land," Black Kettle said, switching to gravelly English. "They cannot be allowed to leave." He revealed that the maze had another name: the Spirit's Trap. It was easy to enter, but for those who did not know its secrets, impossible to leave. The geysers were not random. They erupted on a predictable cycle, and Black Kettle knew the cycle. He could use the land itself as a weapon. A plan was formed, a desperate, brilliant plan to use the maze to turn the hunters into the hunted. Black Kettle would lead them through the secret paths he knew. They would separate Cain's men, using the steam and the confusing canyons to disorient them, picking them off one by one. It would end here, in the heart of the mountain, a final battle for justice. Jacob looked at Sarah, his eyes asking the question. Was she ready for this? The Boston widow was gone forever. She nodded, her hand gripping the cold steel of the pistol. "Let's finish it," she said. The maze became their weapon. Guided by Black Kettle, they moved through passages Cain's men would never find. They used the dense steam for cover, striking and vanishing like phantoms. Jacob, a predator in his natural element, took out two more of the henchmen, using the snares and traps he was so skilled at making. The hunters were terrified, lost in a steamy hell, picked off by unseen enemies. Their nerve began to break. They were firing at shadows, their shouts echoing in the disorienting canyons. Sarah had her own role. Using her knowledge of the ledger, she created false trails, leaving scraps of paper with misleading information for Cain's men to find, drawing them toward the most unstable and dangerous parts of the geyser field. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a strategist, her mind a weapon as sharp as Jacob's knife. Only Cain and his second-in-command were left, cornered and furious. They figured out what was happening and, in a desperate move, tracked Black Kettle back to the sacred chamber. The final confrontation took place in the Chamber of Artifacts. Cain burst in, his gun raised, his face a mask of sweat and fury. "It's over!" he screamed, his voice unhinged. He had Jacob pinned down behind some rocks, but he hadn't seen Sarah, who was hidden in the shadows near the entrance to the Serpent's Eye tunnel. And he hadn't seen Black Kettle, who stood silently by the central platform, seemingly unarmed and unafraid. "Give me the ledger and the key, Thorne," Cain demanded, "or the old man dies first." But Black Kettle just smiled, a thin, chilling smile. "This is not your land, little man. Your power means nothing here." With a sudden movement, he stamped his foot on the platform. It wasn't a platform. It was a lid. A section of the floor gave way, revealing a deep, steaming pit, one of the vents for the largest geyser in the system. A blast of hot, sulfurous air roared up from the depths. Kane's lieutenant, startled, stumbled backward and fell screaming into the vent. Kane, momentarily stunned, turned his gun toward Black Kettle. That was the opening Sarah needed. She stepped out from the shadows, her pistol held steady in both hands. "Drop it, Kane," she said, her voice ringing with cold authority. He spun around, shock registering on his face as he saw the Boston lady he'd dismissed as a fragile liability. "You," he stammered. For a split second, he hesitated, trying to decide which target to shoot. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Jacob burst from cover, tackling Kane around the waist. The two men crashed to the floor, struggling for the gun. It went off, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. For a moment, they were still. Then Jacob rolled off, a dark stain spreading on his side. He was hit. Kane scrambled to his feet, a triumphant, evil grin on his face as he raised the pistol to finish Jacob. But Sarah was already moving. She didn't think. She acted. She fired her own pistol once, twice. The shot slammed into Kane's chest, throwing him backward. He staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief, before toppling over the edge and into the steaming maw of the geyser pit. It was over. Silence descended on the cavern, broken only by the hiss of the steam and Jacob's ragged breathing. Sarah rushed to his side. The wound was bad, bleeding freely from his side. "It's just a scratch," he rasped, but his pale face told a different story. Black Kettle came forward, his ancient eyes filled with a sad wisdom. "He will live," the old man said. "The mountain has claimed its due. Now you must take the story of what happened here back to your world." He helped Sarah bandage Jacob's wound with herbs from a leather pouch, a poultice that quickly staunched the bleeding. They spent 2 more weeks in the sacred chambers, Jacob slowly recovering his strength under Black Kettle's care. During that time, the old Ute elder and the Boston widow shared their stories. Two people from impossibly different worlds, now bound by a shared battle. He taught her the history of his people, the meaning of the artifacts, the soul of the land Cain had tried to steal. Sarah, in turn, read to him from the ledger, explaining the complex web of finance and deceit. When it was time to go, Black Kettle gave them supplies and showed them a secret path that would lead them out of the mountains and toward the distant lights of Denver. "Go," he said. "Speak the truth. That is the only justice my people have ever known." They walked out of the mountains not as a wounded scout and a widowed lady, but as two warriors who had faced death and won. The journey to Denver was arduous, but they were no longer running. They were on a mission. Arriving in the bustling city, they were a strange sight, ragged, thin, but with an unbreakable fire in their eyes. They went straight to the territorial governor's office. At first, they were dismissed, but Sarah's bearing, her precise Boston accent combined with the raw power of her story, commanded attention. And when she laid the ledger, the key, and the Ute treaty map on the governor's desk, the world began to change. The scandal that erupted was seismic. It shook Washington to its core. The names in the ledger were ruined, powerful men brought low by their own greed. The conspiracy was shattered, and for the first time in a long time, the Ute Nation was given a true seat at the negotiating table, their land rights finally and formally recognized, all because of the evidence Elias and Black Kettle had preserved. Sarah's name was cleared, her story printed in every newspaper from San Francisco to Boston. She was no longer a victim, but a hero. The world tried to put her back in her box, to call her the brave Boston widow, but she would not allow it. Her testimony at the federal hearings was devastating. She spoke with an eloquence and fury that left congressmen speechless. She had found her voice not in a Beacon Hill parlor, but in a blood-soaked cabin in a sacred mountain. When it was all over, she didn't return to Boston. There was nothing for her there. Her old life was a costume she had shed for good. Jacob, fully recovered, stood by her side through it all. The army offered him a medal and a commission, but he refused. His fighting days were over. Together, they bought a small piece of land with the reward money they received, a quiet place near the foothills where the mountains they had survived were always in view. They built a ranch, and they built a life. Sarah's sister Margaret, horrified by the truth about her late husband's family, left California and came to live with them, finding a true family in the process. The whispers followed them, of course, the strange pairing of the high society widow and the half-breed scout. But they paid them no mind. They had been forged in a fire most people could never imagine. Their love was not built on propriety or convenience, but on shared blood, shared secrets, and a shared victory over evil. They had children, a son with Jacob's dark eyes and a daughter with Sarah's fierce intelligence. They would tell them the story not as a grim tale of survival, but as a lesson. That courage can be found in the most unexpected places, that sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you truly are, and that even in the deepest, coldest wilderness, two people can find enough warmth in each other to set the whole world right. If this story of a woman who lost her world only to find her true self moved you, let me know in the comments. Rate it from 0 to 10 on pure emotional impact. And if you want more tales of incredible survival and unexpected justice, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know. Thank you for watching.